Okay, so who's for the first question? Hands up. No, this is come on, but like Q&A for Lisa Littman, first of all. Any questions, hands up. Yeah, thank you. To Matilda.
Thank you.
And just make sure to introduce you.
Yeah, of course. I'm Matilda Gosling. I'm a researcher, and it's a question for Lisa about your international tracking study, which is very exciting, and whether you're going to be using, when you're measuring mental health, are you going to be using or kind of mapping the mental health scales to the original Dutch study so that there's more of a kind of long-term body of knowledge that can be developed about mental health outcomes?
Yeah, we do have a variety of scales that we're going to be using. I don't, if you would like to, Dr. Ken Zucker has more information about that, but yes, there are definitely multiple scales that we're using to look into mental health. Ken, would you like to add anything?
We'll be using measures that the Dutch use.
Maybe just get a mic, yeah.
Yes. The answer is yes.
Good. Oh, well, I'd like to hear about the measures that you will be using the measures that the Dutch use.
Well, they started to use measures that Toronto used.
Okay, fair enough. Next. Okay. Maybe yourself, if you stand up, yeah. 1 second, we'll get you the mic.
I'm Adrian Suman from LGBA USA, and this is for Dr. Littman. Your ROGD research was primarily focusing in its results on young girls, but one of the things that Stella has talked about that I think is quite interesting is maybe an emerging cohort of what she has mentioned as like a sensitive young boy who is emerging as not an HSTS youth male transition, but an older transition. Does any of the follow-up research in your most recent work have anything to say about this group that is maybe emergent or such?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's interesting. So I did not exclude boys in either study. So in the first ROGD study, there was an overwhelming number of parents talking about daughters versus sons. In the detransition study, it was 69% female, 31% males, and it was difficult to get more males, but I agree that there is a cohort of males, and they should not be overlooked, that there may be some issues and pathways that are different. It appears different. There were differences with the detransitioners between the males and the females. So we do hope with our numbers, with the study going forward, that we do have a robust number of gender dysphoric males and parents of gender dysphoric males as well as females.
Can I be a bit unconventional and add something
Yes.
to that? 'Cause I just want to say on a couple of the parents that I started with, the boy parents, kind of saying, should there not be also, maybe this is, I don't know, throwing it out there as an idea, a specific study on the boys? I don't know. Is that worth doing as an idea? Or do you think, I don't know, maybe somebody could take up on that? I'd love to see it. I would love to see what's the edge of ROGD and where is the sexual component for men and all the rest of it. Is there any prospect of a boy-only study, like a young man with gender dysphoria?
It's interesting, and I wonder. I think the field this aspect is so new that we are still putting out a broad net. Yeah. But there could be a place for that.
I hope. Yeah, it would be nice.
I'd like to see that too.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we can also disaggregate the data.
Right. We could analyze data separately, looking at the boys. That is, and then write more about that. Also, I think it might be interesting to do some qualitative studies on the, on male detransitioners as well as families of boys and gender dysphoric boys.
Yeah, I think some qualitative you need some good quantitative research in place, and then you can start doing the qualitative studies that hone in on those specific experiences. I think that would be great.
Great. And we'll have a question from Marcus.
Thanks, Lisa. That was really interesting. What I was just thinking
And
about...
make sure you introduce yourself. So
Marcus Evans, psychoanalyst. What I was interested in was the... you talked about the sort of, the mental health problems and the social. And that one of the things that Sue and I find in seeing our cases is that often the hook into the social is to do with a lot of internal self-hatred, intolerance, things that you mentioned, and a fantasy that they're going to become what they always should have been. And in some ways, that's going to remove the problem, as it were. I don't know how you'd research this, but one of the concerns is that obviously the more invested... And as Tavistock used to say, the kid was certain. I always thought that was a problem when you're talking about such serious issues. There was no room for doubt or confusion. But the more certain, then obviously when things don't work out, as inevitably they're not going to, there's always a shortfall between the idea of what transition will bring and then what it actually delivers. And that the more investment there is in getting rid of something, the more difficult it is to deal with the disappointment when it doesn't occur. Now, that's a sort of clinical hypothesis. Certainly, I should see people in King's who thought their personality disorder would be cured. They transitioned, I'm talking about in the 80s, and then they suicide because it didn't work out. But in other words, we've got a particular problem that some kids that are difficult to reach psychologically are the ones that are likely to sort of collapse into self-hatred. Now, that's a hypothesis. I dare say that's not always the case, but I worry about all of them, but you particularly worry about them. How are they going to deal with the shortfall between the ideal and the reality? I don't know if you could put that in your research question.
Because you don't have enough work to do.
It's an excellent point and a pressing issue.
Any other question? Keith, down. And make sure to introduce yourself, please.
Thank you. Keith Jordan, Our Duty. Lisa, one of the recurring themes that we have talking with parents is what we call the script, and that the definition that's used for gender dysphoria was basically a list of feelings, and a lot of the children of the parents that we deal with might present with those feelings, but they've been told to present with those feelings. So we have the concept of it's almost fake gender dysphoria. And I was wondering whether you had anything to say on that, and is that something that you plan to factor into your research?
Yeah, so that was something that I had heard about before I started the first study, and data that came through when I did ask about whether it sounded like the children were using very scripted language. And so some parents even described this as, it sounded like my kid was learning words for a vocabulary test, that it didn't sound like them, it sounded like a script. I think that it is an issue with the social environment, in that there is this environment that's telling kids that a variety of very normal feelings, some feelings that might be associated with mental health issues, but all of those things means they're gender dysphoric. And then they're pounding on this urgency that that's you, and if you don't do this immediately, you're going to, the suicide is going to be an issue. And so there is sort of this false scaffolding around the feelings that these kids are assuming. And I don't know, I'm not a clinician or a therapist in this, but I would imagine it's very difficult to kind of separate some of that out, because the kids do step by step start to believe that. And then become very resistant. I've heard from a lot of parents that talking about the issue is very difficult, because the kids will shut down, or they'll push back with these other scripts, these talking points, like that means, you hate me, that means you're transphobic, that means, you want me dead, all of these things. So I feel like it's an impediment to the therapeutic relationships and the family relationships. But it's challenging.
Can I just add that there's a lot of diagnosed neurodivergence, but there's also a lot of undiagnosed neurodivergence, particularly with these girls. And as somebody who works a lot with anorexia, and we get about 30 to 40% of anorexia is got a neurodivergence complication, and the pathway is very different for somebody living with anorexia who's neurodivergent and somebody who came in what we consider the more standard imagined pathway as you think about anorexia. And so that solidifying of that sort of concrete black and white thinking of it's this, this, and this, and you can't talk. And my daughter is autistic, so she's great. We have a great relationship, but like I'm used to meeting that wall and it's really there and very present with this population. And it's something that anybody who's working in this area ought to be very informed on autism and neurodivergence in general.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Sarah Habibi. I wear many hats, but I'm just going to put the parent hat on for the moment and just ask, has anyone held people like Jeffrey Marsh to account? Somebody who has actually even said himself he is a trans creator, and he invites young, very vulnerable people to become part of his, obviously this kind of glitter family, to talk behind the parents' backs, to pay him through Patreon and to go off, behind the scenes to go and talk to him. And there are obviously lots of people like that out there, but he's the one that, for some reason, keeps turning up in my feed and Twitter, no matter how much I try. Not him, but people keep sharing his videos. And I'm just wondering, somebody like that obviously has a huge influence on someone who's vulnerable and who is repeating, as you said, those phrases that then get repeated back to the parents. So I'm just wondering, has anyone actually been held to account for something like this? And if not, why not? And what can we do as parents?
No.
I do recall that there was a young mom who tried to raise awareness about it, and then she was targeted, and her children were targeted, and she pulled.
What was her name? She was in London. She was English. Yeah, that's right. She was in London. Yeah, and they threatened her and all the rest of it. Yes, I'd like to know the answer. I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you. I'd like to know the answer to the question, why not? I would make it at the risk of sounding, the risk of sounding whatever I'm about to sound. Where are the men folk? Like, this used to be the point where we said as a society, okay, we've done compassion. I know that's very, very gendered, but I kind of think, I don't know, I kind of think,
I gotta
being
say,
careful for legal reasons, but it feels very, very much like this is endangering children in a very serious, potentially fatal way, and I don't understand how, I don't know where he lives. I don't understand how his neighbours are just, I don't know what I would do, but I'd like to think I would do something legal, something. Surely, I don't know.
Okay, we'll have one more question from Karina. And make sure you introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Karina Con. I don't wear hats, my head's misshapen. I was noticing that there's ePath down the road a little bit today, and they had over 200 sessions, of which only one of them concerned the topic of detransition. I have a two-part question. One is that it seems like ePath is a little bit less ideologically driven as compared to the North American version. So I'm wondering, are there opportunities for researchers to get research into ePath that they wouldn't in North America? And then the second point is, since we're at the GenSpect conference, are there opportunities for researchers to present in academic form, perhaps at the next GenSpect conference, to have like an academic track? Those are my two questions.
I think that's a great idea, is to right now it seems that there are two worlds that are very far apart, with some overlap, but it would be nice to be able to have some more neutral conferences where people from a variety of perspectives are able to present in an academic, respectful, scholarly way. I think that would be a great goal.
Would either of you like to answer?
Well, I do think there's more space in Europe, and I thank God that we have public health systems and that we have been, one of the huge things for me is I can refer to systematic analysis of the papers out there. And that is really helpful. And so anytime I'm reviewing this material to share with professionals, I just use systematic reviews. And they are very, very powerful. And, the narrative is shifting in Europe, and that's really, really clear. And that to me is a very positive thing. I can't help the States and what happens there, but having public health systems and having bodies that examine evidence about medical interventions is vital. And, we can hardly consider Finland, Sweden, and Norway to be, bastions of, far-right conservatism here. So that evidence is what's really powerful when, as a professional, you're trying to have a discussion with somebody about the research that's out there.
It's kind of like, WPATH has sort of got to the point, it's like in Austin Powers where the guy goes, there's two things I can't stand, intolerance and the Dutch. I was like, really? Scandinavia, far-right Scandinavia. Far-right Scandinavia.
But just to say, I would love to see a more neutral space, because I can start reading a research paper and I know the perspective the authors have taken from the abstract, from the language they use in the abstract. And I don't think that's right. I actually, as somebody who really values research, I don't think that's right. I don't think I should be able to read the abstract and know the perspective of the researcher.
100%. And I just want to say I do research in a different field entirely, which I think might come up in pronouns, and it's completely abnormal to be able to tell what somebody is thinking automatically in a tribal sense from the abstract.
And can I add to that, because we're in Ireland, everybody who's Irish will know that up the north, back in the 80s and 90s, everybody knew whether somebody was Protestant or Catholic from the car they drove, from apparently
from where they kept the toaster.
Yeah, the Protestants put the toaster in the press, and the Catholics kept it on the sideboard.
And you don't even know what a press is because you're not Irish.
It's a cupboard. It's a cupboard.
Anyway, on that note, we're going to have a cup of coffee downstairs.